it's Precious Pioneer, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, the channel where we talk about food and entrepreneurship and kindness and everything in between. Today I have another podcast helping hub video for you guys. I know that boosting your engagement and getting more listenership is really hard, and so we need to find out ways to promote and to spread our really cool shows upon everybody and to the masses. And so I wanted to create a video to kind of help you guys navigate how to create an Instagram feed for your podcast show, because the thing is, though, it's kind of technical in the sense that you're not really just blurbing out, hey, I got a new episode, hey, check this out, because the thing is, though, Instagram is a completely different platform where you have to cater to the needs and the wants of Instagram people. And so without further ado, let's go. So I'm actually going to jump into my computer screen and show you guys a step-by-step of how I set up my Instagram feed and then go over the different various tips in my computer. So the first thing to note that when growing a podcast, it is essential that you need outside social media. However, the goal isn't to reach 1 million followers. The goal actually is the 1,000 fans rule. You need only to get enough fans and followers on Instagram to be able to listen to your podcast. Through your Instagram, you have to figure out what its purpose is. So I want a page with maybe beautiful photos, inspiration, food and health, to promote the podcast, highlights human beauty, gardening and sustainability, and the aesthetic, of course. That's my personal preference based on Precious the Foodie podcast. Now you need to figure out what exactly do you aspire your page to look like. Is that really cool cars? Is it a talking podcast? And so you want to have different microphones and technology. So you really want it to align with your goals and what your podcast is about. Okay, so let's take a look at my Instagram feed. Cute cheese, right? Anyway, let's first look at some really good examples of what a podcast show should look like. I really like her Hustle podcast, so let's go ahead and look at their profile. And so what we're going to do now is pick out all of the different things that you really like about different podcasters that are in your niche. So mine is a little bit girly, there's gardens and artistic, and I kind of like that aesthetic. And so I'm looking at podcasts that have a decent amount of followers that I kind of want to resemble. One of the biggest things that you want to do when growing your Instagram is to look at examples that meet your standards, and there's always little hints of success. And so I really like the way that they set up theirs. And so if you look down, you could see that they have really nice aesthetic. They have pictures of themselves, like the hosts. They mention their episodes that they're launching. They have little descriptions of what they're about. But then they also have different things that are related to the community. So Juneteenth was happening. One of the biggest things you want to make sure when you're creating your Instagram page is that you're not just spamming with a whole bunch of episode 1, episode 2, episode 3. You want a little bit of diversity so you get an overall wholesome feeling of what the show is about, and then also the people behind the show. Instagram is really good at capturing the behind the scenes, and so that's really what this is about. You want the listeners to be able to connect with the person behind the show. And so continuing down, look, they have ratings here that you can look at, and then also different guests that they have featured on the show. And so I really like the decor, I like the color scheme, I like the different quotes and artistic pieces here. And even though it's not completely relevant to the show, they have different artistic little things that can kind of fill up the Instagram to give it an overall feeling. And then they have little promotional items like looking at the phone to make sure, because the goal is to redirect followers into listeners. And so having little aesthetic pieces where your content is still being shown, but not necessarily saying like, okay, go follow me or go look at this, you really want people to want to, by putting people and bodies behind it. So that's what I really like about this one. So I wrote little notes about that. And then going on to the next podcast that I really liked, let's look at Cold Brew. So something that I really like about them is that they do the same thing. So their podcast is called the Cold Brew Convos, and there's a little description up here. Most of the time you want to incorporate your own name here for host, and then a little bit about what your podcast is about. Most people for the name put the name of their podcast, and I'll show you guys mine last. But I really like the aesthetic of this is her behind the show, but also this was relevant to Black Lives Matter current events. Also a little bit of coffee here, a little bit of quotes. And so you want people to feel your energy of what you're going to bring into the show. So I've never heard these girls on the podcast, but based on the Instagram that I'm seeing, you can tell it's about coffee and that they're bubbly and that they have a really good sense of humor, like this little joke here. And I feel like listening to them would be just very joyful and cheerful based on their Instagram feed. And so that is the message that you want to portray and to give while building your Instagram. Okay, so now let's look at Precious the Foodie. This is mine. To make mine a little bit easier to find, because Precious is so niche down that it's not like iced coffee, so that's a little bit easier to find, but mine is Precious the Foodie, so I just left my name as a food podcast, and then I left a little description here, and then I have little highlights based on the different recipes and stuff that I've made. And based on everything that I wanted, I really wanted the aesthetic of different food and nature and little sneak peeks into the destinations of the food topics that I will be mentioning in my show. I wanted a little bit of current events, a little bit of quotes and things like that. And so looking at my feed, you can definitely tell that I've changed it since when I originally had started. And so I have food indigenous to Indonesia, because that is my latest podcast. I interviewed a lady from Bali, and so I incorporated some quotes of what she said during my show, things that I said. And then I have a recipe that I had made, and that's in my highlights. And then I have little food pictures that are native to Bali. And so scrolling down, I have some dishes that my guest has cooked, and then quotes related to the food titles and relevant to my podcast show. And so my emphasis is developing a very beautiful aesthetic feed, and then in the quotes I have a little bit more of a direct call to action sort of focus. So for here, I would say, okay, on a serious note, what are you guys eating for lunch? Because I'm hungry. And then later throughout the day, I'll post another one related to the podcast, asking if they've seen it, to go ahead and check my bio, because that's where it's located, to kind of talk to my followers throughout the day and kind of see where their head's at, so they can have multiple calls to action to, at the end of the day, you want to direct them to this link here to be able to listen to your podcast show. And so looking at what my feed was originally like, I wanted to make a note that you don't want to just have a whole bunch of direct quotes, because it's very boring. Instagram is a very storytelling page. And so hearing this, you can tell definitely that my show is a food podcast. Also, there's platforms out there like Headliner where you could directly link your RSS feed to create little videos that sneak peek into what the podcast is about. And so scrolling down to the very beginning, if they'll let me, I'll show you kind of what I originally did, and I had very, very little engagement. And so I wanted to let you know that that doesn't work. Like just spamming your followers, there's no interest. If you just post photos of like, hey, this is a quote from my podcast, go look at it. Hey, like direct over here, people want to be on Instagram because they enjoy being on Instagram. But if they see enough of your content and get the behind the scenes feel, then they'll want to outsource of Instagram and listen to your podcast show. So that's very important to recognize the difference and the distinction between the two. So as you can see, they're getting a little bit more plain. Like most of these are just quotes. And so even though I kind of had a general idea of what I wanted my aesthetic to look like, it wasn't that successful starting off. I originally did incorporate some of my tweets, which were actually really popular. And then just looking at it, it didn't really have much going on, to be frank. And so I had quotes of like just plain things, or like, hey, new episode, or hey, and then I didn't even try here. You can see I just screenshotted my Spotify and posted it on there. And so then I started to add a little bit of behind the scenes, like this is me designing, it has my YouTube page actually up on there, but that one got way more engagement than this one, so I started incorporating myself a little bit, and I started to change it and post a little bit more and kind of evolve the storyline of what was actually going on and what the story was about in my podcast show. And then I started adding a little bit more quotes, a little bit more pictures, behind the scenes. People really like to engage with like you. So you want to incorporate pictures of your face, because if you just have a plain feed of, let's say, just this, and then that's your entire feed, people won't really understand who they're listening to. And so it's really important to gauge with people that way. You see, like, I didn't incorporate any of my own personal photos for a while, and so my engagement was a little bit low. The key to Instagram is that you want to bring your stories that you tell in your podcast to life, and then showcase that through your photos. And then you're like, this is so cool, beautiful, wow, so nice. And then you're like, oh, wow, review my show. And then it's like, okay, wow, I did podcast show. You kind of sneak it in there a little bit. And then the call to action comes from, wow, this is so delicious. What is this? It's a purple drink. And then we mentioned this in my podcast show. And they're like, okay, well, I'll go check it out to see what she's talking about. So it's having those question marks at the end of your story, like what story is your Instagram telling? And so let's go back to the drawing board. Okay, so now that you have a new Instagram vision and concept, and you know exactly what your Instagram is going to be about and how you're going to direct your followers and to your podcast listeners, now you want to create a step-by-step layout of all of the different content that you want to incorporate into your new page. I find that having a guideline makes it really easy to just plug in photos and content in the predetermined squares that match your Instagram feed. So for me, I have a photo of people, and that's what I noticed in a lot of other podcast pages. They had photos of people behind the content, people behind the show. And so that is one of mine. It can be either a photo of me, myself, or a photo of my guests, or photos of pictures of people in the community and related to my podcast show. So then it would be quotes from the show that's concurrent with every other podcast Instagram. Also current events, news, that sort of thing is really interesting to me. My next box would be positive inspiration. My next box would be recipes and food ideas. My next photo would be resources in the career field and industry. And so these are the kind of boxes that you want to fill, determining what you found and what you'd like to replicate in your own page according to your niche. What story are you trying to convey? What story are you trying to tell through your Instagram to gain more followers on your Instagram page, and then transition them into followers of you as a person, your brand, your show, to get them to click that link and to listen to what you have to say. I hope that you found this video really, really helpful. If you guys have a podcast show or are thinking about creating one, please leave the title of it down in the comments. I would really love to support and create a podcast community where we can all listen to each other's podcasts and things like that. Mine is Precious the Foodie, as you know. You guys can go ahead and message and DM me on Instagram if you have any questions, and you can tag me in your post. That way I can go ahead and look through your feed and help you with edits and things like that. If you have any questions, I would really love to help you and support you guys. And so I hope that you all have a really great day. Bye. I'll see you guys next time.